Hello, viewers. My name is Garrett Malloy, and I'm here representing my school, Belvedere College, winner of the Zayed Sustainability Prize in 2017. I'd like to open this session by highlighting the importance of our theme: pioneering change, mobilizing youth, and COP28 UAE. Youth have played a pivotal and disproportionate role in fundamentally rethinking the way our society deals with climate change. Their work and the disproportionate impact climate change will have on their lives demand they have a seat at the table. I'm here because I'm really excited to talk with a group of highly accomplished youth leaders. I hope their vision and ideas will inspire you. And without further ado, let me introduce them. Helen Watts is Executive Director of Student Energy, and we'll be discussing youth entrepreneurship. Brighton Kaoma, the co-founder and CEO of Amano Learning and Global Advisor for the UN SDSN Youth, will demonstrate to us what specific outcomes we hope to see at COP28 and how we can achieve that as a youth leadership community. I myself will be discussing the tools youth need to lead. Let me now hand you over to our first speaker, Helen Watts of Student Energy on youth entrepreneurship. Helen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Garrett. And so happy to be here. Maybe I'll start with just a little bit of context as to why are we talking about youth entrepreneurship. So I think just the conversation around youth and the intersection between youth, climate action, sustainability, and the energy transition has been picking up so much speed in the last several years, I would say about 5 years in particular. And that's really due in large part to movement building of young people really starting to kind of take matters into their own hands, so to speak, mobilize in greater numbers, and become highly visible with significant platforms on social media and in their communities. And youth entrepreneurship is really just one pathway for young people to kind of channel that energy and passion for climate action with more urgency, more impact on the ground into real tangible projects. And we see at Student Energy youth entrepreneurship as just such a high potential area that is still lacking really this enabling, how we kind of call it, an enabling environment for young people, especially young people equitably around the world, to really have what they need to participate in the entrepreneurship space. And I would say there's some good positive signals that things are starting to change. I know just last week we saw UNDP's Youth for Climate Challenge just announced a whole series of kind of startup funds for different youth climate startups around the world. The International Renewable Energy Agency recently launched a new gen Accelerator program. Student Energy, we have our own guided projects initiative that supports young entrepreneurs. And so these are all fantastic indicators that ecosystem is starting to emerge and really grow and become more accessible and visible, but there's still so much to be done. And so I'll share a little bit from our experience in running one of those types of programs and what we've learned and what we really are advocating for now to policymakers, to financiers, to larger institutions to just support more young entrepreneurship. So we have a program that I mentioned called Guided Projects, and all of Student Energy's programs, it's maybe an important preface to this, is run through a youth empowerment model, which means our programs are all designed by youth for youth. In my view, in Student Energy's view, that's actually a really important tenet to supporting youth entrepreneurship as well. We need to be listening directly to young people and what they need and what the barriers are that exist in order to design programs that are really fit for purpose for young people. And even us in designing this program by youth for youth, we learned so much in just the first pilot year of running that program that we're now applying to kind of the next phase of that. And I'll go back a little bit. So back in 2017, we actually launched our first kind of foray into the space of youth entrepreneurship with a program called Greenpreneurs. It was a program that was run that I actually co-founded myself with some kind of co-conspirators at Youth Climate Lab, another youth-led NGO, as well as the Global Green Growth Institute, which was a really big deal at the time and still currently being kind of a large development agency supporting that program. And we took that program through 4 years of running this virtual accelerator for 10 to 15 teams per year, who would then at the end vie for small scale startup funding. Our biggest learning from doing that program was, one, the importance of mentorship and connections, both locally and regionally and globally, and the importance of resources. And what we really struggled with that program over time was just seeing that as we were supporting more and more teams, it became patently clear that the only teams that were really going to have what they needed to take their projects to the next level were the teams who were accessing that startup funding at the end of the program, which was really only 3 to 4 teams per year. And then even within that, the ticket size of those grants was so small, relative to larger grant making in and investment in the energy space, that it was really challenging for a lot of them to kind of continue taking their projects past year 1 or year 2. And so that's where we started to kind of really think critically about how are we making sure that when we talk about providing resources to youth, we really understand what that means and what the real need is there. So maybe I'll come back full circle a little bit to Student Energy's ethos of what an enabling environment looks like for youth entrepreneurs. So we've been running for about 15 years now, and we've seen that the formula is actually relatively simple for supporting young people to channel their unique skills and passion and energy into high impact roles. Young people need resources, like I mentioned. They also need training and accessible education and connections and mentorship to get those skills into those high impact roles. So there's one piece here that's really important around collaboration. So we realized a few years back that we actually need to spend a lot more time investing in our ecosystem to ensure that young people have pathways beyond a program like guided projects or, these other programs that we've been a part of supporting in the past. So we developed programs like our career training program, for example, to actually facilitate mentorship connections between young people and high impact companies working in local or regional contexts like Okra Solar or New Energy Nexus Vietnam, and with global or cross-regional companies like Carbon Upcycling, Sustainable Energy for All. And then looking kind of beyond collaboration, we also need to actually be scaling training to make it really accessible and scaling education programs to make it accessible. To scale programs like that, there's just a real need for more resources to actually be accessible to organizations. There is also a need for resources to support youth-led startups, but also at an organizational level for those educators, for those training mechanisms. We actually need more resources to meet demand where it's at. We've seen over the last several years in particular, demand from our youth network has absolutely skyrocketed as young people are mobilizing more around climate action, are wanting to find ways to create impacts in their communities. And so actually making resources more readily available to organizations like Student Energy, but like Youth Climate Lab as well, like Indigenous Clean Energy, the Clean Technology Hub in Nigeria, to meet that rapidly increasing demand and ensure that we're really supporting enabling environments on the ground with specific kind of groups of communities. And that's really a call for policymakers and financiers, both corporate or philanthropic, to actually commit funding and enabling policies to support these actors, these organizations. Then there's a role at kind of a socio-cultural level as well, where we need to be building awareness of opportunities in the space, getting young people excited and valuing their own skill sets. Student Energy did some work with LinkedIn and Orsted on this just these past couple of years, and found that even naming the skills that young people have to offer is a huge barrier for many. Young people don't really know what skill sets they're bringing to the table necessarily. And so supporting young people to actually name and value and internalize the value of those skill sets that they bring is hugely important, while working also to get policymakers and employers to really understand and value what young people have to offer. We also saw that there's a huge barrier to young people in just awareness of opportunities that exist for them as entrepreneurs or as entrepreneurs in the space as well. And then finally, the resources. So speaking a little bit from guided projects, what we found is, or from Greenpreneurs initially, we were giving grant sizes of about $5,000 USD. We just found that that wasn't going far enough. So through guided projects, we started giving grant sizes of about $10,000 USD. We found through this last pilot year that even that isn't enough. There's just continuous kind of hurdles and expanding and evolving needs that really vary from team to team as well. And a lot of challenges still in getting young people beyond that first in funding to be able to access further investment or larger grant sizes beyond accessing resources. So also looking really critically at what we mean by deploying resources. There are organizations that do this, that kind of re-administer funding. It's really important, but there aren't many, to be frank. And there's not a lot of foundations either who are doing that type of role. And we see too often when it comes to youth-led projects that the grant sizes tend to be kind of within that like $500 to like $2,500 range. And I think it's really important for us to just get a lot more honest about what resources are really needed and kind of valuing young people's offerings at the level that we value some larger organizational offerings. And so we're starting to evolve now into offering closer to kind of $30,000 to $50,000 range grants. That also really allows young people to participate more equitably in the space as well. Young people can afford to actually go into part-time work or have support for their families, actually be able to balance their commitments, their real life commitments with this project that they're trying to get off the ground. And then a couple of other learnings that I just want to highlight from, I know there was kind of an element in here about how we've learned from kind of our failures. And I love kind of talking openly about failures because I think that there's sometimes a real nervousness to kind of be, especially with youth, because we feel like there's such a high pressure to perform and to like prove that youth are worthy, that we often struggle to kind of talk about what hasn't worked well. But it's really important because we can then kind of build on each other's work and continue to be more and more effective in the space. So in our approach to supporting youth entrepreneurship through guided projects, we found that one thing we weren't doing that we needed to start doing is actually supporting young people with this like baseline foundational skill set. So things like Excel, how to use Excel, for example, to manage a project budget. That was a huge gap. We also found that on staff, we needed way more language abilities on staff if we really wanted to support guided projects globally. Just being able to kind of communicate in English and French just isn't enough. And we're not going to be kind of a globally inclusive program if we can't have that offering from our educators in-house ourselves. I mentioned as well that kind of training on fundraising beyond Student Energy's grant. So how are we actually training young people on investment readiness, training them on different kind of financial mechanisms that exist in the space, and then really supporting that project developer mentor network so young people can actually learn from other project developers who've worked in similar contexts with similar regulatory frameworks, with similar procurement processes, and again, kind of build on those knowledge sets and really allow them just to be more effective with limited bandwidth and limited experience. And one of our kind of pivots that we've recently taken with the program is we're starting to focus a little bit more now on less like broad brush, we want to support every young person everywhere, taking on a solar PV project, for example, but actually focusing a little bit more on like training through the types of projects we're supporting as well. So focusing on more localized high impact projects that make sense, are actually meeting the greatest need from an energy transition perspective in that given context. So for example, in a context where energy access is still a huge need, focusing on supporting young people to deploy distributed renewable energy or a microgrid solar system versus a location that is more high energy consumption per capita, focusing more on demand side reduction, energy conservation, energy efficiency projects. And those are both like very accessible project models for young people to take on, but they do require a lot of guidance and a lot of support and that mentor network and those resources. So that's where we really come in to create that enabling environment. There's more to be done and there's more for us to learn and share on that, but I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Helen. I mean, that was a very insightful talk. And today I'm going to discuss just some of the ways in which we can empower youth to lead, which kind of bounces off what you were talking in terms of enabling environments, and the way in which we can allow young people to either create businesses or startups that activate climate solutions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about climate leadership. So this looks like the youth getting involved in policymaking. It looks like youth getting involved in the consultative process and the legislative process, and the way in which we can bring youth voices to the table. So the youth have a disproportionate stake in this climate crisis. We all know that. Not only are they the group that has initiated a total societal rethink of climate change policy, impelling politicians to act, they are the group that will experience the true effects of climate change and the degradation of our Earth to the greatest extent. Their lack of vested interest within society allows them to clearly see the scale and pace that is needed to resolve this crisis. Therefore, given that youth have rightly put climate change back on the international political agenda, we must look for ways in which we can continue to empower youth and give them a voice. One, firstly, the policies that seek to address this crisis, and secondly, to hold our leaders accountable when they fail to deliver. So the first way in which we can empower youth to become climate leaders, in my opinion, is to create enabling environments. And I'm going to open this up to the panel for maybe one or two sentences. So I want to ask the panel if they could summarize just in a few words, what were the enabling environments for them that allowed them to get involved in climate change and make an impact and allow other young people to spread their voices? So I don't know if Helen, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first. Mine will be really short, but to be frank, my enabling environment was really organizations and leaders who recognized and understood the value of youth perspectives and youth offerings. Is that something that we need to massively increase in the space so that more people more people in my kind of position, starting position, can just feel valued right off the bat. I went into applying for my job at Student Energy and thought there was absolutely no way I was going to get this job in partnerships with no experience. But Meredith, my former executive director, she was running a youth organization. She understood why, taking a bet on somebody who's passionate and young and doesn't have that kind of on paper experience is a good bet to make. So we need more people willing to make bets on young people.
Yeah. And Brighton, I don't know if you want to come in.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Helen, for providing that background. I think we need to really ask the question of what does an enabling environment truly mean? because it differs in different contexts. And I believe young people equally are quite diverse in their specific needs. That's why it's very important for us to look at it from a very broader perspective. In my experience, an enabling environment was just having a leader in front of me, giving me the tools and resources needed for me to be able to take on opportunities. It's identifying a young person with hope, determination, and energy, and telling them, I'm behind you, I'm with you, I will support you, I will guide you. That's a level of intergenerational mentorship that, for me, became extremely critical in harnessing specific opportunities. I started out as a radio broadcaster when I was only 14 years old in Zambia, specifically addressing pollution as well as indiscriminate emission of toxic chemicals from the mines, the copper mines in this case. So I realized that nobody was speaking about this on radio or on any media platforms, and I went to the nearest radio station. And this year, one person, the director of the radio station, decided to bet on me very early. And I think an enabling environment is betting on ideas that might not conventionally be supported in other different institutions or contexts. It's providing the mentorship, providing the guide rails, and allowing young people to be able to take action, especially in areas where they feel safe, they feel protected, and they feel most relevant.
Wow, so I think that was really interesting to hear, because there's a common, in my opinion anyway, there's a common theme across that. It's leaders within civil society betting on young people. And that's exactly what we need for this climate crisis. It was like your lead Meredith betting on you, or the radio station betting on you, Brighton. So I think one of the ways in which we can do that, and I'll talk about that later, is giving the resources to civil society to be able to make those bets, and to have the funds, to have the funds and the resources to be able to go out and invest in young people and expand their businesses and expand their enterprises. So when I think of my own climate journey, which has led me here today, like Helen and like Brighton, I think of a long list of enabling environments that serve as a launch pad for climate leadership, and that all happens throughout civil society. And that's why it's so key to invest in civil society, and that looks like government funding. And it started with national science fairs, youth assemblies on climate, and finally continues with me speaking to the Irish Parliament and developing climate change policy with elected representatives. And these enabling environments were created at two levels, and I think Helen and Brighton touched on that really efficiently. At the micro level, we need to create spaces where facilitators and educators can discuss climate change. So this is done by investing in civil society, investing in education, spreading awareness through the media, and offering youth leadership and consultative positions in institutions. Because we really need to value our youth when they're working within climate change. That doesn't mean a role that doesn't necessarily have significance, but it means getting them involved with policy makers. It means giving them a voice, because their voice really counts, because they have a disproportionate stake in this crisis. And at the macro level, to create these micro-enabling environments, we need robust institutions that radically advocate for a carbon neutral agenda. This looks like introducing education on climate change as a mandatory module in schools. This looks like government bodies such as the UN and educational institutions focusing on climate change as a global catastrophic risk and acting accordingly. And when we do that, we create an atmosphere in which civil society feels enabled to get the resources necessary and allocate them towards climate change. And this macro level movement creates an atmosphere that permeates all throughout society and enables those micro environments and fills us with a desire to solve the issue of climate change. And these enabling environments are not a nice to have. They are a necessity to solving climate change. And I think Brighton and Helen's experience with that tells us that, because the reason why they got involved is because the civil society, and the same for me, civil society and people were willing to take bets on young people and get us involved within climate change. And it's a formulated policy brought by leaders and passionate activists that I like, Meredith, that you talked about, Helen. Citizens must play a role in policies, citizens assemblies, youth assemblies. These are what's needed to go above and beyond emissions reductions goals and formulate, gather, and implement policies that are endorsed by society as a whole. And this is part of the just transition. It's bringing everybody along. It's not mandated at a government level. It's involving all of society. And when we involve all of society, we get better perspectives on policies. And when we do that, people are able to understand why they might have to see a tax increase to pay for investment in renewable energy. They're willing to take that on because they've been brought along in the process. I also want to highlight a crucial point for creating enabling environments. I think that's lifting people out of poverty is a prerequisite for the creation of enabling environments. If the developing world only has time to focus, or doesn't have time necessary to focus on climate change, they will simply not have the time to involve themselves in climate leaderships. And that's why things like the loss and Development Fund with COP27 is so important. We have to effectively implement schemes that create economies in which people have the financial means to engage in activism. I mean, currently countries are deadlocked on the Loss and Damage Fund from COP27. We need the realization that for developing nations to deal with climate change in a meaningful way, they must have reached a basic level of economic well-being. And this is done through infrastructure projects to move away from autocratic regimes and investment initiatives that are paired with anti-corruption legislation. The democratized developing world needs something of a $1 trillion Marshall Plan styled climate fund that pairs rapid economic development with climate investment. And I think that also I'm going to turn to ways in which we can motivate the youth to take part. And I think that comes down to the ways in which we set an example as civil society and set an example as leaders in society. So when I worked as climate ambassador, sponsored by the Irish government's Department of Communications, inspiring and motivating our youth is the key to ending climate change. And to inspire and motivate the youth, we must offer them hope. We are lacking one of the crucial parts of this puzzle, and we're not providing a concrete set of solutions to meet high-level policy goals like net carbon zero when we commit to agreements such as the Paris Climate Agreement. Whilst goals are good, they alone are not sufficient. None of the world's leading economies, including every G20 country, are currently on track to meet the commitments made under the Paris Agreement. These goal-setting exercise without real commitments is truly a failure of these summits. I would rather see a list of specific policies that will be implemented by countries at COP28 than an elusive goal-setting exercise on 10 years, 20 years down the road, we're going to cut this amount of emissions. So we can no longer set targets and we can no longer lament the issue. We must now agree on demonstrable actions to show the youth that it is possible. Because when leaders don't just say they're going to reduce emissions, they begin to implement the policies or state the policies that they're going to implement. They're held accountable to them, and it becomes a lot more realistic. And by creating that environment, we allow young people to get involved because they see that there's hope and they see that that's a possibility. So without any further ado, thank you for your time. I'm going to pass you over to Brighton.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for providing that background and also just highlighting the loss and damage aspect, which is extremely critical in this space. I think it's important to also recognize, as you've mentioned, the critical role that government, the private sector, as well as civil society plays in ensuring that there is more sustainable alliances and partnerships between youth, government, private sector, and civil society. After spending some time running a media and youth advocacy organization in Zambia, to later serving as Global Youth Director at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, I kept interacting with so many young people, majority of whom are running their own for-profit and non-profit organizations. And one of the most key elements that was coming out of these experiences was a desire to build more intergenerational learning opportunities, both focusing on personal capacity building, but also on organizational development opportunities that these young people were leading. Majority of the young people that I worked with were first co-founders or founders or partners in their own organizations. And I would see more often than not the desire for coaching, the desire for mentorship, the desire for more genuine collaboration. This is what gave birth to what is called Amano learning. And Amano learning partners with subject matter experts and industry leaders to create upskilling content that is accurate, up to date, relevant to real world challenges. And this focuses primarily on getting the top leaders in institutions. So we go to places like Google, McKinsey, the World Bank, the United Nations, and we carefully vet experts that have been in the industry for a very long time and have gained expert knowledge and experiences. And we work with them to develop very digestible bite-sized courses that we put on our platform. And these synchronous and asynchronous courses are provided to individuals, especially young people that are running their own organizations. So these might be in Kathmandu or in Malawi or in South Africa or in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And we guide them through either cohort-based learning, where we enroll a cohort of co-founders and young founders, or even those young people that are just thinking about ideas of starting their own in enterprises, and they're at the prefixes of launching their solutions. So we guide them through this learning journey, and they understand aspects ranging from leadership. How do you lead yourself? How do you lead others? How do you lead your organization? And we see that there is no, learning institution in the world, even in Ivy League institutions. I had the privilege of going to Columbia University. I never at any particular point saw any leadership dedicated training and capacity building for young people. So this is a gap that we continuously started observing. So we developed this digital learning platform that is being developed with many content focusing on leadership development. So we have very simple courses such as, emotional awareness. How do you deal with conflict? How do you work together? How do you empathize? And through short bite-sized videos, we call it learning on the go, young people are able to access all this type of content. But in addition to that, being a climate expert myself, the other offering that we provide is climate change and sustainability training. So we provide, digital learning content on our platform, and then we work with experts from, other institutions such as Esri. We work with partners and climate scientists from other global institutions like UNFCCC that come and deliver short trainings focusing on climate and sustainability in languages that are non-scientific and easily digestible. And what we are also seeing is a huge uptake in climate financing trainings, because as you might know, not everybody has got the opportunities to go to higher learning institutions, especially young people from the global south, to be able to access high quality training. And that creates even a larger gap of disparity, because if there's no democracy in learning and capacity building, then we'll continue going through this vicious cycle of inaction, even at greater, higher levels like the COP28, where we need to make sure that we provide learning, training, and capacity so that young people can make the needed action. So young people come into our program and they learn skills such as climate analytics, climate financing, carbon capture technology. They also get exposed to carbon markets. How do you quantify? So those hard skills and soft skills combined are what gives us that critical value proposition of intergenerational learning at Amano. But when we look at the COP28 in respect of capacity building, training, and finance, one important aspect which happened in 2019 was the pledge to mobilize $100 billion annually from 2020 onwards. And that was focused primarily on getting these resources from both the public and the private sources. But we've seen that this target has been unmet. And it's very important for us to start asking critical questions to leaders about how we're going to make sure that we meet this particular target. As you might know, billions of dollars have been mobilized to advance climate, to advance just transition, and to also advance the Sustainable Development Goals. But it's not news that we need trillions. And we see estimates that puts the gap at $3.9 trillion annually in the case of climate action and the Sustainable Development Goals. Hence, we need to think about specific financing mechanisms. For example, expanding blended financing is going to be one important aspect, because the private sector is the single largest source of capital for advancing climate action and Sustainable Development Goals. But we see that capital from institutional investors such as pension funds and sovereign wealth funds is stymied by the real and perceived risks associated with projects in emerging markets and developing countries. But for us to be able to ensure that we include everybody, we need to make sure that those that are left behind are made first. and developing countries that continue to suffer the debt burden while addressing poverty, disease, and the triple challenge of climate change needs to be recognized in this particular space. It's exciting to also have seen that the African continent is now part of the G20. Now it's now G21. I think it's those type of global unconventional decisions that we need to see come out of COP28. But also, most importantly, going back to the issue of representation, we need youth to be not only on the table, but be given a space and chance to contribute to these decision-making processes. Therefore, representation of diverse young people, which also requires financing, is going to be extremely critical. But as Helen described, the aspect of providing sizable amount of funding in youth-led organizations becomes extremely critical. I've always had the habit of going to any organization that considers itself to be youth-saving and looking at their annual budgets, their balance sheets, looking at their financing and the distribution of their cash flow to just really understand how much financing are they putting towards youth development. And it doesn't really take much resources. Young people's projects can be de-risked through sizable 50, 100,000 pockets of financing. But in addition to that, we need to distribute resources, but also provide the mentorship and support needed to make sure that there is sustainable impact in youth-led solutions. That's the reason why at Amano, we focus primarily on how do we train the next generation of leaders that understand climate challenges, but also understand how to lead themselves, lead their organizations, and lead the people that they work with. Therefore, I believe that COP28 is going to be a critical event that will determine how young people in the next coming decade perceive the role of government and the private sector. It's also going to set a foundation for the Summit of the Future, which is happening in 2024, where the Global Compact for Future Generation is going to be unveiled. Therefore, I wish to equally also recommend and implore young people to think about how they can continue innovating, they can continue speaking up and speaking out, and not shying away from actively engaging in the political, economic, and social discussions in their respective communities.
Right, thank you very much, Brighton. That was very insightful, especially it talks about the finance necessary, blended finance, public and private. So I want to start with a question just for the group. So this is one of my questions, and I'm sure anybody else can pop in with the question if they want. So with the financing for the loss and damage fund still not resolved and governments deadlocked over where they're going, and furthermore, we've seen a number of COPs fail to address meeting our emissions targets. How do you think we can create a COP that is different? We can create a COP that sees governments begin to commit to these policies that allow for the attainment of emissions targets, and also to see that the loss and damage fund is properly enacted and financed. I don't know if either of you want to start this up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first. And yeah, my answer might be a little bit like cheating a little bit, because I'm also going to advocate for kind of taking things beyond COP. But I do think that COP still continues to be, especially for the youth community, a really important space for us to actually, like, for many young people, it's really the only forum where they're able to directly access their own governments. That's a really important moment and kind of opportunity window for young people to begin that discourse. For me, like, an avenue that I'm seeing as holding a lot of potential right now is pushing governments to commit to creating youth advisory bodies to actually directly engage with them on, like, breaking down some of these barriers to following through on commitments, to actually, like, getting real about, how is your commitment actually backed up by a real, tangible, measurable action plan. Having young people come in and actually support governments directly in doing that work, I think a lot of that can get seeded and kind of initiated in the COP space, especially if you start to really pull in how other governments are starting to commit to the creation of youth advisory bodies that can help kind of de-risk that idea a little bit for governments too that might be hesitant. And if your own government is not receptive or it's not a safe space for you to participate in that way, really looking to that civil society community and actors who are working to really influence more directly at that kind of policy and legislation level, looking to how you can kind of get involved with their work and build off work that's already happening. But it's a tough one because I do think so much of it will happen outside of the COP space ultimately. So it's about how much we can really like leverage that space of access and then take that work back out into the real world post-COP as well.
Sure, I couldn't agree more. I think definitely it really does have to happen outside COP. There's only so much talking that we can do, and the policies need to be implemented and thought of outside COP, especially for national governments. Brighton, I don't know if you want to.
Absolutely. I think it's also critical, in addition, to think about how do we make sure that we create a more unified global youth investment fund, which focuses not only on for-profit organizations led by young people, but also NGOs, social enterprises, pulling funding from government, from the private sector, from philanthropy institutions to invest specifically in youth solutions. This fund would specifically address the huge burgeoning funding gap that we see. As somebody that had a bit of experience working with government entities, I see how red tape tends to slow down progress. But when you look at entrepreneurs, the level to innovate is much easier. The level to be able to deploy solutions is much easier and be able to see measurable impact, unlike institutions that take so many months and so many years to see progress. So it's that level of agility in deploying innovation that prides in youth-led institutions, especially entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, and organizations. But at the same time, this Global Youth Investment Fund should be very aware of the ongoing developmental challenges that are quite heterogeneous. We see that some regions around the world face persistent challenges such as conflict, we see instability, we see weak institutions, which hinder progress towards the SDGs and the climate action investments that is needed. That is also causing a lot of lack of international cooperation. We see that global cooperation and partnerships tends to be quite vital for mobilizing resources and expertise to address the climate crisis. Therefore, achieving consensus and coordinated action among nations can be very challenging. But through this Global Youth Investment Fund, we'll see that those barriers of red tapes and hierarchy are going to be broken, focusing primarily on identifying, nurturing, and investing in youth-led innovations. And at the same time, recognizing the fact that these challenges that we are facing right now, like emissions and the climate crisis, are challenges that don't need to be solved tomorrow. They are quite urgent. And it's that level of agency in investments that we need to create. If we don't create that level of agency in mobilizing resources, then we'll continue going through the same vicious cycle of discussions at big conferences that might not yield any positive results. Hence, this particular COP should look beyond the conference itself and address the systemic challenges, because young people attend these events, they're into these particular spaces, and then tomorrow they go back to the same challenges they are facing in their communities. And we don't want that to persistently continue. I've equally worked with so many young people that are even struggling to make ends meet because they dedicate so much time to volunteering their time, their resources, to addressing these global challenges. But I think that needs to stop. And that can only stop when we put our foot down and be able to engage global leaders into a dialogue that results into results-driven commitment to investments in young people. We want to see the dollar value at COP28 rather, into youth-led innovations. And I think that is going to be the most critical element that should be addressed.
Yeah, I think a global youth investment fund is an example of something that addresses systemic challenges, like you said. I don't know if anybody else wants to add a question, but just coming back to that whole idea of a global youth investment fund, I feel like a way in which we need to bring people in is to create a socially just climate transition to a carbon neutral economy. And a way in which that needs to be done is we need to represent underrepresented groups, marginalized groups, Indigenous voices, people from developing nations. And I think a global youth investment fund is one of the ways in which we can do that, to ensure that we get people from underprivileged and underrepresented backgrounds to COP, to make sure that their voices are heard, because these are the people that are most impacted by climate change. And I know that you both have a huge, vast wealth of experience working with youth and empowering youth. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on the way in which we can bring in underrepresented backgrounds into COP.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because I know even just this year in seeing like the badge allocation process for COP, for example, and we do quite a lot just in our role in kind of having to gone to COP since Paris, since 2015, doing a lot of work to just communicate with the other youth communities that are going to COP, to figure out, and the NGO community, to kind of figure out like, okay, where are things at this year? How is like the perception towards youth? How are we kind of feeling about youth inclusion? One challenge that I've been seeing is that as delegations have less and less badges, for example, as one like access requirement to go to COP, it could be resources as well, it could be funding, but in this case, we'll use badges as an example. As badges get tighter, I see still like consistently the first people to get dropped off that delegation list are young people. And I think that there's more work for us to do in really advocating, like kind of getting honest about that fact in this space, and being a little bit more ready to like not necessarily kind of call that out directly, like call out specific actors, although, you know, that is always an option as well. But I think calling in the larger community into a real and honest conversation about the fact that that is happening, and providing an avenue for like a pathway for them to do differently by either like you've been kind of explaining, Brighton, like making the business case for why including young people and investing in young people is so critical to like your bottom line or whatever you're trying to do in the space, why bringing young people onto your delegation is like just a really good look as well. You'll get incredible communications content. They'll be so effective on the ground. They bring energy to the space. And so really like actually just getting honest about the fact that like there are conscious decisions that are happening to leave young people out and to leave diverse voices out of these spaces. I think as well, like access to resources is a really important one. So for example, if you are in a position where you have access to resources to be able to fund people going to COP, making sure you're really looking critically at like how you're allocating that and how you're kind of, just how you're ensuring that those voices who are not in the space are going. And then there's a lot that we need to do as well to ensure like the safety and well-being of people who are going to COP. There are a lot of people in my community and the youth community who are just so exhausted and emotionally drained from the climate space and participating. And I think a really important part of inclusion and accessibility is also looking at how we're creating accommodations and like supporting the well-being of young people as well. That might be, more flexible resources for them to like go with an accessibility buddy to the event, or maybe be able to be supportive of COP from outside of the space where they're finding it's like too taxing. So I think there's lots to kind of explore there, but I think my biggest point is just that like, I think we need to get real that young people are still being deprioritized and left off delegation lists more often than they should be. And I think governments are one to call out on that, but I think NGOs as well are ones to call out on that, especially kind of the larger institutions. So that's a place that I'd like to start.
Yeah, in addition to that, I would say we also continue to see like a revolving door of similar youth in the same spaces. And I think it's important for us to just get real and realize that we have over 1.8 billion young people. We need everybody to have the opportunity to be in these spaces. And that begins by leaving nobody behind. It might sound like a cliche statement that is spoken about in a lot of spaces, but there's a real meaning to the word leaving someone behind. And if we really become very genuine about the true meaning of the expression, we can then begin to reflect within ourselves, especially for individuals that have the responsibility to make decisions in institutions like government, international NGOs, the private sector, to truly think about communities that have been disproportionately left behind. Because if we do not bring them into the space, then we continue preaching to the converted. And the COP28 is not a platform to only speak to those that already understand what the climate crisis is about, those that believe in taking action. We have to reach an extra mile and identify those individuals that equally might even struggle to understand what climate change is, but it's happening in their backyard, and bring them to the space so that they can speak for themselves and ensure that their voices are heard at the highest level. And that begins by working with local organizations that understand the local context and the local challenges that their communities face, and bringing these human interest stories into the space. But this also begins by majority of us that have the privilege and opportunity to be in this global international fora to begin advocating and speaking out about our colleagues, our friends, and those young people that don't tend to be in these particular spaces, because we are carrying on our shoulders millions of youth. And it's incumbent upon ourselves to think about how we do not underrepresent those that don't have the privilege to be in these particular spaces. The other thing is collaboration and partnerships. In a global connected world, collaboration and partnership becomes even more critical, because the time for a lone ranger is long gone, where somebody would come from elsewhere and solve our challenges. It's up to us as global youth to think about creating more realistic and meaningful avenues for partnership and collaboration. This begins by thinking about how being in South Africa and having these arbitrary borders does not mean you can't collaborate with somebody who's in Ireland or somebody who's in Sydney, Australia. It begins by perceiving yourself as a global citizen. And therefore, it's us young people that should think about creating such levels of partnerships. If I'm running an enterprise in Mexico, how can I work with other colleagues who are doing something similar and transfer that knowledge and technology to Zimbabwe or Bangladesh? If I'm designing solutions in China, how do I think about working with other young people in New York? So it's that level of collaboration that we desire the most, because the pathways that led us to where we are, such as industrialization and emissions, came as a result of individualism and not looking at the world as an interconnected place that we all live in, and not looking at the planet Earth as the one asset that we all share in common. And for us to be able to see that there's representation, global cross-border partnerships will be extremely critical now more than ever.
Yeah, Brighton, I love that you said that. It brought to my mind one part of our chapters program that we saw recently, where we had our chapter in Algeria, in North Africa, and our chapter in Manitoba in Canada, actually actively collaborating on a clean cooking project together. And we were like, oh, like young people just do it naturally. Like we get that, we are kin, and that collaboration is just how we're going to get the solutions that we need, and that this is a trans-border problem far and beyond. And I think, investing in young people in that perspective just makes so much sense, because we're also investing in like that societal shift that will allow us to feel more connected and more kind of in unity over these shared challenges, and feel like we can build on each other's knowledge without it being like proprietary and secret and damaging or risky. So yeah, I mean, not to get really philosophical about it, but I just love that you brought that up, because I think it's a really important point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've really touched on the most important aspect, because collaboration might also enhance knowledge transfer and technology transfer. And what we've also decided deliberately within Amano is to ensure that how do we get expertise from the world's best institutions and take it where it's needed the most? And how do we develop this level of training and development and work with young people that are in Kenya, work with young people that are in South Africa or Angola? I think it's this level of resources, even non-financial resources, that can allow us to create a world that is ideal, that is sustainable, that is also fair and just for every person. I think it's the level of democracy of resources, both financial resources, technical knowledge resources, that will allow us to address these problems faster than we imagine.
I think that was an absolutely enlightening discussion, from financially scaling youth solutions, like to enabling environments, to the policies that we need to implement at COP to see the necessary change. Helen, do you want to deliver the final and closing remarks?
So to wrap us up, we'll just have each of us share in one word how we would describe the future of sustainability, looking at 2023 being named the year of sustainability. And we'll keep it to 1 minute each. Garrett or Brighton, did you want to go first?
Sure, I can begin then. I think the one word that I would say that describes the future of sustainability is quite simply humanity. I think that it's humanity on so many levels. It's humanity on the level of empathy and kindness, because this climate catastrophe is killing people and people are dying from it and people will continue to die. And it's humanity because it is only humans coming together and collaborating that is going to solve this problem.
The future of sustainability, to me, translates into inclusion. Inclusion for everybody, irrespective of where they are, irrespective of how they speak, irrespective of how they look. It's an inclusion of everybody, because the challenge that we are facing of sustainable development requires diverse ideas and solutions from everyone. Sustainability means everyone, everybody, everywhere.
And for me, the future of sustainability is tangible, real, concrete, measurable action plans, funding that actually leaves the commitments and goes into communities and affects real people's lives, tangible projects that just make change on the ground happen. So we'll wrap it up there. But thank you everyone so much for your valuable insights. Too much content to try and wrap up into 1 minute. So we'll just encourage you to watch the video and share. It will be posted on the Zayed Sustainability Prizes YouTube channel as well. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.